In this video, I'm talking all about dynamic range. So let's get into it. So when it comes to purchasing a brand new video camera, you're going to look at a whole different array of video settings. You're going to look at the frame rate, how many frames per second can the camera shoot. You're going to look at resolution, does it shoot 1080, 2K, 4K, 6K? And then there's also this one setting called dynamic range. What is dynamic range? What are the numbers corresponding to, and why does it matter? Well, dynamic range is kind of a big deal, so let me run you through that right now. So essentially, dynamic range is the difference between the darker tones and the lighter tones in your video camera's image. And when it comes to looking at your camera settings, it's going to list something like 14 stops of dynamic range. This is basically the max amount of dynamic range that the camera can handle. Now, essentially, the higher the number of the dynamic range, the better the camera is going to perform in extreme conditions. So, if I was inside a building and I wanted to expose the inside of the building, if I had a lower dynamic range number, then it means the outside will completely overexpose. This is because the camera only has a smaller amount of dynamic range, which means it can only expose a smaller section of light. So I can expose a darker area of the video, but if there's a lighter part of the video in the frame, then that will just completely blow out. So now in that exact same shot, if I flipped that and I expose for the brighter areas, so I expose for outside the window, inside the window will be completely black. This basically means that your image is underexposed because, again, your smaller dynamic range can't handle that shadow detail. So typically, when it comes to looking for a camera, you want a camera that is able to shoot a higher dynamic range. So 6 stops of dynamic range is nowhere near as good as 16 stops of dynamic range. Now, if we look at a camera with a higher dynamic range value, so let's look at the Sony FS7, for example. This has around 14 or 15 stops of dynamic range. Now, this isn't going to be perfect, but if I was to shoot that same shot on this camera with the higher dynamic range value, if I expose for the shadows, even though the highlights aren't going to be completely in detail, they're not completely blown out. It's still a usable image. Essentially, dynamic range is the one real difference between an amateur camera and a pro camera. We've got all these new cameras coming out which can do 4K, 6K, 120 frames per second, but they just don't look as good as cinema cameras. And that's because they don't have the same amount of dynamic range. Yes, it can shoot in 4K, but it can't expose the highlights and the shadows at the same time. So even though it shoots the same resolution, you're not getting that same quality of light in the image. So the next time when it comes to purchasing a camera or hiring a camera, you really want to look at the stops of dynamic range. The higher the dynamic range number, the more parts of the image you're going to be able to expose correctly. And there you go. It's quite simple. The dynamic range is simply just referring to what can the camera expose in the frame. The higher the number, the more your camera can expose. So if you enjoyed watching this video, or if you found this useful, then please do let me know in that comment section below. See you on the next video.